So the first thing I'm going to do is just give an overview for those of you that haven't been before, is that what we'll have is we'll have a talk from this evening's speaker, and then we'll have a bit of a 5-minute break, just so that everybody can stretch their legs, walk around and get another drink or something like that. And then we'll resume with the question part of the evening. So the way that's going to work is that during the talk or during the break, if you think of any questions, if you pop them in the chat, then we'll read the questions from the chat and we'll have a discussion based on those questions. So I think that's everything we need to cover. And so without further ado, I will hand you over to Maren, who's going to tell us all about Fires and Us. So thanks very much for this, Maren. I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you can hear me. My name is Maren, and I will talk a bit about fires and how fires are studied by geographers today. Okay, let me just see if I can. Okay, the slides are working. Perfect. So just a brief introduction about myself. I'm a geographer interested in human-environmental relations. I received my PhD from the University of Zagreb in Croatia in 2014. The topic of my PhD was land use and land cover changes during post-socialism. So later you will maybe learn how land use and land cover changes can actually be linked to fires. I joined Bournemouth University in 2016 as a lecturer. My work is rooted in geography, but my interests extend to environmental history, biology, cultural studies, social psychology, and political science. And many of these things, which I listed here, are actually very relevant when discussing fires. Today's lecture will have 4 chapters. I will start from a very wide perspective. I will talk about early fires, which started something like 400 millions of years ago. And then I will focus a bit more on human relationship with fires. And the last 2 chapters will be about some rather more contemporary research into wildfires in the United States and Europe. And Europe is, of course, the focus of my research. I'm very much interested in fires, but I must say I'm not a fire ecologist. So if you expect a fire ecology lecture, I will do my best to include ecology, but this lecture will cover other hopefully interesting topics as well. Okay, so I said I'm going to start with a very wide perspective about early fires. The first question you might ask yourself is, why study fires to start with? Well, fire is an important part of today's terrestrial world. Every day, somewhere in the world, a fire burns. Some of these fires are natural fires, while others are started by humans. Another interesting fact about fires is that fire is unique to Earth. And the way we captured fire as humans is unique to our species, because proper fires are not burning anywhere in the solar system apart from the planet Earth. And furthermore, only humans can start a fire, sustain it, and spread it beyond its natural habitat. So fire is indeed a very, very fascinating phenomenon. But when we talk about the history of fire, it definitely predates the history of human species, because as I said, our planet has been burning for over 400 million years. How do we know that? How do we know that the first fires burned 400 million years ago? Well, that's an easy question to answer, because we found charcoal, and the earliest charcoal preserved can be traced back to the Devonian period. And this Devonian period gives a sort of an introduction into why fires started burning only 400 million years ago, which is, of course, a very, very long time ago. But we do know that our planet is much older. our planet is older than 4 billion years ago. So why did so much time have to pass for the fires to start burning? What do we need to have for a fire to start? This is also an easy question. This is a simple lecturer's trick. Always start with easy questions to get your audience interested in things. Of course, the origin of fire on planet Earth is linked to the origin of plants. And the plants are responsible for 2 out of 3 elements essential to the existence of fire. And these 2 elements are oxygen and fuel. Of course, if you know the geology and history of our planet, plants did appear more than 400 million years ago, but it took a lot of time to have a sufficient amount of oxygen in atmosphere. So with plants and oxygen, we have 2 elements of the fire triangle. We have the fuel and we have oxygen. And the third part is heat. And this is an easy one. Fire heat sources were always very easy to find on our planet. They used to be, and they still are, lightnings, volcanoes, and luckily not so often meteorites. Okay, so now we know the planet is burning, and it has been burning for 400 million years ago. And when fires started burning, they became an integral part of our ecosystem. Fires started affecting wildlife. Fires started affecting plants and soils. But we also do understand that not everything burns the same. There are parts of our planet which burn often and at regular intervals, while other parts of our planet burn more rarely or sporadically. So when we talk about these frequencies of fire burning in nature, we are actually talking about fire regimes. This is a technical term. When you talk about fires in science, in fire ecology, this is a fire regime. How often does the fire burn and where? These regimes existed in the past and they exist today. Hopefully you will be able to see this animation if I press play. So this is the map of the world, and NASA, using its satellite, recorded all the large fires on our planet through a period of, I believe, 1 year. And if you look at this animation, you can see how every month there are huge fires burning in areas such as Europe, such as the sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and really, really large areas in Mongolia or Australia. So we indeed do live on a planet which is constantly on fire. And these fire regimes are complex, and they were complex even before humans started altering them. And once humans started changing them, it became even more complicated, and we will, of course, get to that as well. Okay, so as fires appeared on our planet, life, of course, adapted to it. And here are just some of the examples of how life adapted to fire on our planet. On your upper left corner, you see donkey orchids. Donkey orchids grow in Australia, and they bloom only after large fires. In the middle photo, you see Pinus contorta. This is lodgepole pine, and pines are generally an outstanding example on how fire is the driving force between certain adaptations. In cases of pines, very often it's the bark, the thickness of the bark, which makes trees, which helps them survive massive fires, and their cones very often explode and spread their seeds only at high temperatures. On your right-hand side, you see a fire beetle. Fire beetle is a very, very cool creature. They can they can sense fire from miles away. They have basically infrared sensors, which helps them find stumps, which are still hot after fire, and they lay their eggs there. Why? Because the stumps are still hot, the wood is still hot, so there are no predators to disturb these eggs. So fire appeared on our planet, and as always, life is amazing. Life adapts to everything. So life adapted to fire as well. And as said, it was humans who profoundly changed these natural fires, these fire regimes, the rhythms of fire on our planet. And fire in return actually changed what it means to be human. Fire massively affected human evolution. There are numerous examples of how fire affected human evolution, how it made us human. I'll just talk about a few. So the first one is we could cook. And basically it's believed that the rise of Homo erectus from its more primitive ancestors was actually fueled by the ability to cook. That is, to use fire. So cooking supplied us with different types of food which provided us with more energy. Fire was also detoxifying. There were less parasites, less bacteria in the food we were eating. So all this improved food made us stronger, fitter, and healthier. Also, cooking was a more complicated process from beforehand, from the way we ate before we had fire. So it implied a sort of a delay in food consumption, which required the development of social abilities. So first you need to have somebody who will catch the food, somebody who will skin the meat, somebody who will chop it, somebody who will burn the fire. So this division of labor actually facilitated development of social abilities. We also shouldn't ignore the socializing effects of gathering around nighttime campfires. We still enjoy doing that. We are still sometimes hypnotized by fire, and we do gather around fires and exchange scary stories or remember our youth. So fire does have this social component as well. Fire also was used in hunting, killing vermin, clearing ground for human habitats, and even warfare amongst tribes. Some of us would claim that war is actually what makes us human, unfortunately. Fire promoted the dispersal of humans across the planet by allowing us to colonize cold environments and protect us from predators. So all these uses of fires by humans also impacted not only the fire regimes, as we said, but entire landscapes. So we started using fire. Fire changed us, but we also used fires to further change the landscapes we lived in. A very simple examples are some of the landscapes in Australia or California, where entire ecosystems are dependent on regular burning. The wildlife depends on regular fires to be healthy and to sustain itself. And we call this pyro landscapes or pyrophiliac landscapes, landscapes which not only sustain fire, they thrive on fires. But we also need to understand that these landscapes are not so much dependent on lightnings as a source of ignition, but on humans. And they have been dependent on humans burning these fires for thousands and thousands of years. And we actually don't have to go that far across the world. We don't have to go to Australia to see how landscapes are shaped by fire. We can just go to the south of England, for example, where there are parts of national parks such as Dartmoor or other peatland areas in the UK or other grasslands, and pollen analysis actually has shown that this was covered by a Betula species, which is birch, if I'm correct in English. So birch trees grew here, and then humans removed them over 6,000 years ago by regular burning. And when we see these landscapes today, we don't think of them as burned landscapes. We think of them as natural environments. We take them at face value, even though they were dramatically shaped by humans and fire many thousands of years ago. So to further complicate the relationship between humans and fires, we can add the Industrial Revolution on top of all this. Why is Industrial Revolution important for fire? Because we used fire to burn fuel to power our engines. And these fires, which were burning fossil fuels, started releasing massive amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. CO2 that was deposited eons ago, and in a very, very short period of time, we suddenly released it. And we are just starting to understand how profound these changes caused by fires actually are. Also, apart from its more pragmatic use, fire was also fascinating, mesmerizing, and became a part of many folk tales and myths. And if you remember, the slide I started with, a naked man holding a torch, it wasn't there for nudity. I hope you recognize that was Prometheus. And Prometheus in Greek mythology stole fire from gods and gave it to humans, only to be very severely punished by Zeus. The Pandora's box story and all the horrible things which were spread upon humanity because Prometheus dared to steal fire from Zeus. Then, for example, we all know the story of the bird of Phoenix that lives for 1,000 years and then burns and then emerges from the ashes and then lives for another millennium, which is a symbol of death and rebirth. I don't know if you're familiar with the sacred fires of Vesta in ancient Rome. Rome had a temple where the eternal fire was burning for hundreds of years. And these fires were supposed to symbolize the protections God had over Rome. And then one of the last Roman emperors put out the fire, the sacred Vestal fire, in 394. 20 years later, the barbarians raised Rome. And some of the people said it was the punishment for putting out the holy Vestal fires. Or, for example, bonfires are a very, very good example of the way we use fires in rituals. So the fire has the power to cleanse, but it also has the power to purge and punish. A powerful symbol of fires in hell, or the way we treated women in the medieval times, where thousands of women were burned at the stake, supposedly to cleanse their souls from sins. But of course, the actual reason was much more pragmatic. So this is just an introduction into how intricate and complicated stories, a relationship between human and fire are. And they don't include just the scientific, quantitative aspects of fire as a chemical, physical, or a biological phenomenon. It also includes stories about fire. It also includes our culture, because humans are beings of culture, and ideas of nature, ideas of fire never exist outside of our cultural context. And the meanings we assign to nature cannot help but reflect this context. So basically, the way we think about fire affects the way we behave towards fires. And the beginnings of this cultural, political, and economic influence on fires and fire management can actually be traced down to late 19th century. Again, the Industrial Revolution. And the first major fire suppression policies happened at the time in the West. And they happened they started happening in the US for two reasons. The first one was very obvious. People wanted to protect the environment. But then the question is, if we had these fires already for millenniums, who are you protecting this environment from? So that's actually the question we should be asking. The idea behind protecting the environment can actually be linked to this romantic period of 19th century, where humans decided to go back to nature, where we glorified living a simpler life, and where we had this wonderful idea of nature as a Garden of Eden in perfect harmony. and fire was a very powerful symbol of something disturbing this harmony. Of course, there was another more mundane reason why we prevented fires. It's because of money. Rich industrialists in the late 19th century, they wanted to protect their resources. They wanted to protect raw materials from burning because they benefited from timber industry. So wood logging was a very important part of economy in late 19th century United States. And there were massive campaigns which wanted to stop fires from happening in these wooded areas. There was another reason why fires were described as dangerous and damaging to nature, because it was used as a tool to advocate the removal of native populations from protected areas. Native Americans have been using these forests for thousands of years, and occasionally they would burn these forests, and these forests adapted to this burning. So local rich industrialists wanted to protect again their resources, amount of standing timber, so they advocated the removal of native populations, and they described them as poachers and people encroaching on the environment. And they called it protecting the resources and protecting the settlers. And you can see a painting from 19th century USA where local people are shooting down Indians, where they're killing Indians, and the picture is called Protecting the Settlers. So it wasn't just about, it started as protecting the environment from fires and protecting trees as a source of income, but many other campaigns spread from that. Many other campaigns embraced this idea of the harmony of nature, and they started shaping the opinion of the general public, where fires are bad. Wildfires in our beautiful forests are bad, and they disturb, disrupt the harmony of our nature. And some of the images which were used are very powerful. For example, this was used during the Second World War and after the Second World War, where being careless and setting trees on fire was basically equated to, you recognize, even though it's a caricature, you recognize Hitler and the emperor, Japanese Emperor Hirohito. And on the left, you see one of the banners, which are still very popular in many parts of the US, the Smokey Bear. He's a mascot in Yellowstone, Yosemite, and he's saying, remember, only you can prevent forest fires because forest fires are bad. So as always, in some places, these ideas backfired. In places where we had fires happening from time to time for many thousands of years, only to be stopped very dramatically and very thoroughly, what happened? Suddenly, you had a pileup of a lot of fuel that could now freely burn. Fuel which would normally burn in small fires across years, suddenly you had no fires for 10, 12, 20, or 30 years. So of course, what happened were mega fires. And I have a 3-minute video, which hopefully I'll be able to share. It's a very recent video. Okay, let me see if it's going to work. I'll put the volume up as much as I can. Hopefully you will be able to hear it. It's only 3 minutes, and then I'll come back to the lecture.
Here in the Bay Area and really statewide is our fire danger, more frequent and more destructive. Mega fires have ripped through California more in the past 20 years than they did the entire century before. That's according to data that we have compiled. So what's the plan moving forward? Let's bring in investigative reporter Candace Wynn. Candace.
Yeah, Raj, these mega fires that burned more than 100,000 acres used to be rare, but now they're almost annual. Experts we spoke to are calling this a new fire reality that maybe we shouldn't fight, but learn to work with. North of Sacramento, the Dixie Fire burned nearly 1 million acres this summer. And the August complex fires burned more than 1 million last year around Mendocino County. While most wildfires are small, our investigative unit analyzed more than a century of CAL FIRE data and found a clear trend for megafires, which burn more than 100,000 acres. The data shows there have been more megafires since the year 2000 than during the entire previous century. It's a new reality, says UC Riverside professor of geography, Rich Mennick.
It's night and day. It's a new fire universe in the 20th century.
And has worsened exponentially in the 21st century. In 2021 alone, there have been 7 megafires. For perspective, there were only 10 recorded in the entire 20th century. Most of these fires are in wildlands, but some are reaching communities. CAL FIRE data shows megafires burning millions more acres compared to decades before. In 2018, the Camp Fire, a megafire, destroyed thousands of homes and killed more than 80 people, leveling the entire town of Paradise.
So I think
CAL FIRE Captain Robert Foxworthy says you should be on alert no matter where you live.
if anything, the last few years have proven that it is possible for fires to burn in those populated areas.
Captain Foxworthy says among firefighters, megafires used to be career fires, once in a career. Now they're emerging several times a year.
Obviously, when we have a 1 million acre fire, it's going to be tough to have all the fire resources needed right that second when that fire starts. So that's why we have these mutual aid systems that we have in place.
Moving forward, Professor Mennick says we need to reevaluate how we manage fires, constantly weighing allowing some of them to burn to break up vegetation versus trying to fight them all.
I object primarily to the word fighting. I think we need to learn that we're not dealing with a monster in a military fashion. We're looking at an Earth's surface process that's always been operational, literally for millions of years. And we need to learn how to work with fire instead of fighting it.
While some fire officials say the megafires are a result of our changing climate and increased drought, Professor Mennick there questions that. He insists forest management and fire strategy are bigger factors. Both sides agree, though, the frequency and fierceness of these megafires remain a reality for California right now. With the investigative unit, I'm Candace Wynn.
Okay. I'll get back to my lecture. Hopefully successfully. Okay, scrolling down to where Okay, I hope we're back. I hope you see the slide where we left off. So California is a good example of how these things backfired, causing mega fires, but you don't have to, some of the changes are less dramatic, but not necessarily less important. And these removal of fires from ecosystems were still very detrimental. It affected habitats, it caused loss of habitat and declining biodiversity. And if we want to bring this discussion about fires and burning into the UK, we can also mention, for example, heathlands, heather in the UK, which is a very cherished habitat. And as you probably know, heather, Calluna vulgaris, regenerates freely from the stem bases when burnt, and germination of its seeds is promoted by fires. So there are ecosystems in the UK which were shaped by fires in the past. Also in heathlands, species such as juniper are removed by regular burning. So there are effects which are not necessarily as dramatic as megafires, but they still shouldn't be ignored. Okay, so now I'll just focus on something a bit more contemporary. This is a wall of text, which you're not required to read. Basically, the main point is fires during the 20th century have been decreasing because of A, fire suppression policies, and B, development of very efficient firefighting equipment. And if we look at the data, at the beginning of the century, 70 million hectares a year were burning, mostly in temperate forests in the Northern Hemisphere. In 1960s, it decreased from 70 to 15 million hectares. And then at the end of century, further decreased to 11 million hectares. So there was a massive decrease in fires in the Northern Hemisphere, at least. At the same time, fires burning in the tropics have risen exponentially to 54 million hectares in the 1990s, mostly reflecting the use of fire in deforestation and agriculture. And the latest data is actually showing that, again, forest fires are increasing in temperate forests in the Northern Hemisphere. So the question is, where are all these fires happening, which we're talking about? So you can still recall the animation I showed where you could see the fires across the planet, but maybe it was too difficult to see the pattern. And the pattern is basically telling us that the three most fire-prone areas in the world are dry grasslands called savannas, which are very common in Australia, Africa, and South America, the Mediterranean, and North American pine forests. And California is one of the nice examples of North American pine forests. This is not to think that fires don't happen in other places. We also have fires burning in Siberia very often, and the most famous one was from 1915, where a forest fire affected the area the size of the UK, one of the largest fires ever recorded. So that just as a reminder of the animation, you can still see that dry grasses are burning, areas in the Mediterranean and California. These are the most fire-prone environments in the world today, and they have been for many years. So we also explain how this relationship became complicated due to industrial revolution and burning the fossil fuels and altering fire regimes and fire protection policies in the US, which backfired. And you can also add to this increase in population, tourism, economic growth, only to begin to understand how complicated the issues with fires is and why it's important to have a very, very interdisciplinary research. And if you look at the news, at the media, at the internet, when we hear about fire, it is sometimes about how beneficial they are to humans, but most often it's not only about the negative aspects, which is the damage to infrastructure or lives lost. This is basically how we perceive fire nowadays. Of course, loss of human lives is a tragedy, and in many places, fire suppression policies are exactly aimed at this, preventing loss of human lives and massive damage to property. And in the Mediterranean, in countries such as Greece, France, Italy, or Portugal, 2,500 million euros each year is spent on fire suppression policies, which is basically fire detection and suppression. Another consequence of wildfires, for example, when fires change land cover, this can increase in flooding. This can lead to increase in floods. If you remember the massive floods in Australia, which happened a couple of years ago, after the fires stopped, people thought, okay, the worst is over, the fires are gone. However, the floods which ensued were massive and caused horrible damage because there were no more, because burned ground couldn't absorb falling rain and there was no vegetation. Every summer when we look at the news, we are always reminded about the devastating powers of fire. So these are just some of the images from the last 2 years from the media. This is a fire that ravaged Portugal a couple of years ago, or the city of Split in Croatia. Or again, we don't have to go very far. These are the fires which happened in Wareham 2 or 3 years ago, COVID made me unaware of which year is it and when it happened, but I'm pretty sure it was 2 or 3 years ago. So this is probably the only way we hear about fires in the media. And then we ask ourselves, what causes fires? What do all these places have in common? And again, we did talk about this. You need to have fuel, you need to have heat, it needs to be dry and hot, but still something needs to start the fire. And the research has shown that most of the fires on our planet nowadays are actually anthropogenic. Up to 95% of all fires on our planet are basically happening because of humans. And the remaining 5 to 10%, 10 to 20% is usually by lightning. And of course, it differs across the world. In densely populated areas, lightning is very, very rarely cause a fire. In places like Canada, we do have fires which are started by lightnings, but in most cases, it's intentional burning, agricultural burning, cigarettes, barbecues, and stuff like that. And me, as a human geographer, I'm more interested in this fuel aspect. I'm not sure about the time. I'm going to finish in 10 minutes. I hope that's okay. So we don't have too many slides remaining. I'm mostly interested in land cover, how land cover can help us understand fire and maybe possibly prevent fires in the future. And when we talk about land cover, we do understand that there are trees which burn more, trees which burn less. For example, pines have very flammable resin. But then the question is, why do we have pines in some areas? It's not just about a natural spread of some species. Maybe it's because we like them, maybe because we use them in horticulture. So this is the layer of human culture I'm very interested in. When we study forests, you have forests which accumulate undergrowth, versus forests with very little undergrowth. Then we have forest fires versus agricultural fires. Some of these fires we call prescribed fires, and they have been used in agriculture for thousands of years. And on top of all this, you can also add changes in land cover, which are happening across Europe, basically driven by agricultural abandonment. In some areas, people don't do farming anymore. So there is an increase in shrubbery, which really, really likes to burn. And this is what I'm mostly interested in. Fires in the Mediterranean. One of the reasons is very obvious. I am from Croatia. So a lot of my studies are linked to this environment. My latest research was about Dalmatia. It's a typical Mediterranean region located in southern Croatia. You can see images on the right. And obviously these images are to tell you what you already know. It's a big tourism hotspot, and more people are moving from inland Croatia to the coast to work in tourism. And they're abandoning their previous jobs, farms, etc. And these processes are happening in the entire Mediterranean. Spain, Portugal, Greece have all have the same issues. And this is an example of an emptied hinterland in Croatia. Basically, we have more fuel to burn in places which were farms in the past, and we have fewer people who can actually spot the fire and report it on time. And of course, this is, for example, a photo from central Spain, and as I said, things like happening across the Mediterranean. My research focused on Dalmatia. The last paper I did, basically we mapped around 500 fires which happened in this region in 2 years, 500 largest fires, because on average you have more than 1,000 fires every year in these small counties. And mapping basically means pinpointing a location, and this mapping then provides us with additional information, such as the date of the fire, the time of the fire, and also what is burning exactly, what type of land cover are we talking about. And then we can also add things such as distance from roads or settlements to see if this affects fire occurrence and fire spread, or maybe is it population characteristics. Maybe in areas where we have more farmers, maybe in areas where we have more tourists who are camping and they have barbecues. So all these things can be studied if you do a proper mapping analysis. We wanted to supplement our research, and so we did interviews with local farmers and firefighters to see what their opinion is on the problems. And these are just some of the findings. Two things which are burning the most is actually shrubland and grassland. Forests don't burn that often, but once the fires start, forest fires are of course the largest in terms of surface affected. We also established correlation between places where fires are happening and where there is a decrease in population. And we said it might be because people have abandoned agriculture, there is more fuel, and there's nobody to report a fire. But we also realized that fires are happening in areas where there are still a lot of people practicing agriculture. And one of the reasons, which was hinted in our research, is it's due to prescribed agricultural fires, which were always happening. So the question is, why do we suddenly have more fires and more things are burning, but people are still doing the same thing they did in the past? What changed? Another interesting link we found was there is no link with tourism. We don't see more fires in touristy areas compared. And then we did some interviews with firefighters and farmers, and these interviews told us there are other aspects which affect fire occurrence, which is infrastructure, both in terms of roads, firefighting equipment. There is a lot of deliberate ignition and human carelessness. There are some species which have been planted to encourage tourism. Aleppo Pine is an invasive species, but it grows really quickly. It's beautiful, it's green, it smells nice, and campsites started planting it because you would become much more attractive in this arid, rocky environment by having all this lush greenery, only to realize that Aleppo Pine encourages fire and thrives in fire environments and actually suffocates other species. After fire, they spread like crazy. We also found that there were some conflicts between the farmers and the firefighters. Basically, firefighters said, no, prescribed fires, they are bad, they're causing us headaches, they're causing massive damage. We need to tell the people to stop burning their agricultural waste. But actually, further research has shown that prescribed fires are good because they get rid of all this fuel that could burn in the past. But what's changed is climate. So 100 years ago, people would have prescribed fires in April and September. But the weather has changed, the temperature has changed. It's much hotter earlier in the year and stays warmer later in the year. So one of the ways of mitigating this issue is maybe advising local farmers to burn their fires earlier in spring or later in autumn. This is one of the findings. And the last finding was there is an increase of this thing which is called wildland urban interface, which is a big thing in studies. And wildland urban interface is basically a continuum between highly urbanized areas and so-called wild areas. And lately people have realized how much they enjoy access to nature, and we started building more and more houses in these beautiful green forested areas. But at the same time, it meant we are building houses closer to environments which are burning. And it's the same with floods. We do like floodplains, we do like overlooking the river, the lake, but we actually shouldn't be building very close to rivers because rivers do have the tendency to flood. So the same way forests in many parts of the world do have the tendency to burn sometimes. So more careful spatial planning is important here. Okay, so to conclude, I hope that I've managed to show how both environmental but also human factors play a role in the occurrence and the intensity of wildfires. People are the main cause, but maybe people are the main answer to how to prevent fires in the future. And as the professor from our video said, we need to learn how to work with fire in places where we cannot stop them. And one of the ways of doing this is designing smart landscapes Another way is promoting the practices of landscape stewardship, where we take care of our landscape in a way which would make them more resilient to fire, and more importantly, which will make us more resilient to fires, but at the same time letting fire and nature take its course from time to time. That's it from me. Thank you for your attention and your patience.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. I think we've all got some food for thought there, particularly since there was a fire at Studland the other night there as well, wasn't there? So another heathland fire. So what we're going to do now is we'll just take a 5-minute break, let you have a chance to have a deep breath, Maren, and then we'll come back at 5:02. And in the meantime, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, folks. While we wait on people putting some questions in, I've just got a question round about, so you were talking about the abandonment of farmland. That obviously, as time goes by, the sort of nature of the plants and everything is going to change, isn't it? That how do you think that's going to affect the patterns of fire as the ecology changes of the farmland or abandoned farmland?
Yeah, definitely. So this has already started affecting fire regimes. So we are seeing many more fires in areas suffering from agricultural abandonment. And one of the ideas is that in some places the local government has actually started paying locals to either continue farming, or if they can't continue farming, to do prescribed burning. So there is just this fuel that wasn't there in the past, and we don't know what to do with this. So we are already witnessing these changes. I think I have a question in the chat which was sent directly to me. So I don't think you can see it as well.
Nope.
It's from Eric, and Eric is asking to develop this idea of working with fire. So in the context of climate change, are our options being more limited? So an example of working with fire would be, basically the simplest one would be to allow fires to burn. And it's very difficult for us because we need to change the way we think. When we see a beautiful forest, let's say it's a part of a national park, and it's a beautiful woodland with flowers and butterflies, and for us it's really difficult to understand that maybe it's beneficial for it to burn from time to time. And again, it goes back to humans as cultural beings, and how our opinions are shaped by different media and media outlets and internet. So we need to also work on not just the ecology of fires, but we need to work on humans for them to understand fires aren't necessarily always bad, and we shouldn't always just strive to put them out. And I do worry when I tell someone, well, there's this beautiful forest on this lovely Mediterranean island, but it has been burning in the past many times. So maybe if a small fire starts this year, don't put it out. People would think you're a crazy or a pyromaniac. So very often it's the public resistance to processes which are happening, which we need to work on more.
I suppose, especially if it's an area where people have sort of managed it and cultivated it to be this beautiful forest that is no longer natural, but
Yes.
it's pretty.
Yes.
But it's also these sort of areas that tend to be nature reserves and trying to protect specific species, isn't it?
And also these nature reserves bring money.
Mm.
So you do want to go to a place which is famous for forests, to enjoy forest walks and fresh oxygen and wildlife. And then if you've read that it burned to the ground, or it was heavily damaged in a fire, you're probably going to take your money elsewhere. Yeah. So
interestingly, Emma's sort of got a bit of a follow-on from that. Is she's saying in places such as the savannas where fires are a common occurrence, are they seen as being more beneficial and natural, or do humans just not live there?
Thanks for the question. So most of the fires in savannas are also very often started by humans, especially in South America and Africa, but also in Australia. So it's a form of clearing the grasses to enrich the soil with nutrients. And in most places in the subtropics, you have the dry season and the wet season. And then you use the dry season to burn these tall grasses, which you have no use of, to enrich the soil so that you can use it you can plow the fertile land in the wet season. So the fire regimes in these areas are much more, let's say, accepted by the locals. But then again, when we talk about Australia, you do have bushfires happening very often, and people do understand you do have it from time to time, and it's something you shouldn't fight against. But then again, you have these massive fires which happened a couple of years ago, where many people died and a lot of infrastructure was damaged. And then maybe it also affects what people think. Maybe people will say, oh, fires aren't as good as we thought, so maybe we should start putting them out more to prevent the disaster from happening. So yeah, every time you have humans involved in something, everything gets very complicated.
I think we just come along and mess things up, don't we?
Yeah.
There's a question from Margaret and David, who said, I've read some years ago that deforestation of Eurasia by humans prevented the world dipping into an ice age, which would have had a huge effect on human developments. Is that an accepted possibility?
So when we talk about deforestation in Europe, the majority of deforestation happened between the 5th and the 15th century. When we talk about the Western world, so talk about Germany and France and the UK. So most of large forests were deforested there. And there were some changes in climate during this time. So we had the Little Ice Age, we had the Dark Age cold period, but we also had the warmer periods. And some of the hypotheses claim that it's also due to changes in forest cover. For example, one of the largest cooling periods in Europe happened after the Black Death in 14th century. And one of the theories or hypotheses is because of the Black Death, because of the plague, almost in some places half of the population died, so nobody was farming anything for decades. So forests grew everywhere, and this forest decreased the temperature, increased the amount of vapor in air, which did affect the climate. So there are some hypotheses which are trying to identify the interactions between forest cover and climate changes, but I would say it's still a hypothesis, and there isn't enough evidence to claim that it's actually a theory. So yeah, but there is a very interesting thing there which we should definitely explore more. Yeah.
Can I come back?
Yeah, do you want to jump in there, David?
Yeah, it was actually about deforestation thousands of years ago, so maybe more in Asia than Europe. And, you know, there's been a regular cycle of ice age, and we should have had one a couple of thousand years ago. So maybe that's more Asia. Is that a possibility, or?
I mean,
it's a hypothesis.
Yeah, as a scientist, I would never say 100% this is not a possibility or something like that. But generally, the study of ice ages and interglacials focused more on the Earth's tilt towards the sun, which changes over, you know, the precession and the nutation, the Milankovitch cycles, and it also focuses more on how continents are moving, the plate tectonics. So these are the things people focus more when they study ice ages. My educated guess, educated but still a guess, would be that massive changes in forest cover can affect things locally, can speed up some things, can postpone some things, but I wouldn't be confident to claim that massive planetary changes such as ice age could be determined by the existence of forest cover.
I think there need to be a hell of a lot of forest cover.
Yeah, I mean, if there weren't humans, entire Europe and most of Asia would be covered by forests, and the entire North America. So we in theory, we are a very, very forested planet, but then humans came. So.
And Asia is very large.
Yep.
And Russia.
Yeah, the largest forest in the world is actually in Russia. People always talk about the Amazon as the largest forest, but the Russian taiga is much bigger than the Amazon, actually. Yeah.
Just not quite the same tropical type environment.
Yes, and not so biodiverse, to be fair, but still very important.
Yeah. So does anybody else have any questions? Okay, so we've got Alicia that's asking, in places where fire worship still exists, if they do still exist, have people a different relationship to fire management?
Well, this is a more of an anthropology question, and I'm afraid I'm not a very big expert in anthropology. I just maybe have an example of how fire worship or use of fire is linked to some things. When Vikings invaded Iceland, they needed to decide who gets which land, and they needed to see is, you know, this person is going to get 100 hectares and this person is going to get 50 hectares. So they gave each one a torch, and whoever got to burn more land, they would get more land to own in return. So there are numerous really interesting stories about how we use the fire to show how strong we are, how powerful we are, what we could do. And there are still many places where fire is worshipped, but I'm not sure what the fire relationship there would be. But always humans are very aware of the beauty of fire and the importance of fire, but also the danger and the destructive. And I think this is also what makes it interesting to worship. You know, if you know how to use it, it's beneficial. If you leave it out of control, you're a goner.
It is an interesting concept though, isn't it? That, you know, is that why people are worshipping fire, is because of that they realize the relationship that we've got with it, that it is useful, but it is dangerous as well.
Yep. Yep. And it's also one of the four elements which many mythologies have. So the entire world, everything consists of soil, air, water, and fire. The only four things you need to have everything. Yeah.
And you need all four for life.
Yes. Yeah. And they even say that the primordial soup, the beginning of evolution, we had all the proteins and everything in this big soup, and you needed a lightning strike to create some changes, which basically resulted in the birth of life. Yeah.
There's nothing like a bit of a zap to get us all going.
Yeah. Literally. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? If you'd like to maybe ask them in person, if you're not sure about typing them into the chat. Everybody's gone very quiet. I think it's been a long year. Okay, thanks, Anita. She's asking, what do you think is the future of fire in fragmented and very urbanized European landscapes?
Yes, that's also a thing I'm very interested in. Thanks, Anita. Basically, that's the biggest issue in Europe. We have humans everywhere. The population density is very high, and fires are happening. More people are dying. More infrastructure is being damaged, and this is where these smart landscapes and landscape stewardships comes in place. suggestion would be we need to have designated areas. We need to say, okay, this is where you can build, and this is where we need to leave these areas untouched. And if they want to flood, they can flood. And if they want to burn, they can burn. But of course, this is a big issue because in Europe, there is a scarcity of land. We have no idea what we want to do with our green belts. We don't know where to build houses. And finding an answer to this question will be very, very difficult. And there are so many stakeholders who will be involved because land is a commodity. And how do you just say, okay, this land which we can sell to developers is now going to be left to burn and flood? And yeah, that's, I'm afraid what's going to happen in the next 20 or 50 years with fragmented and urbanized European landscapes, and how we'll respond to this threat of fire.
Can you maybe just explain a bit more of what you mean about smart environments?
Yes, so for example, a simple example would be smart landscaping. So if you want to build a house, there are some plants and shrubs you're encouraged to use. There are some plants and shrubs which you are suggested to definitely avoid. There is a suggested gap between large trees and your garden and the house, because large trees closer to houses, of course, increase the risk of losing your property. Having fire breaks in large forested areas where when the fire burns, it reaches a break and then there is nothing to burn because it's barren, but maybe a few hundred meters later, the forest continues. So there are a lot of things which we can actually do to improve the resilience of our landscapes. And also we do have all this amazing technology now for monitoring fire, for following the weather conditions, which could also help us understand how and where fires are appearing and in which places what to do, basically. Yeah.
Interesting. So really more thinking and planning is needed, not just sticking up houses. There's a question from Eric that's saying, pointing out that burn, don't burn is clearly a more nuanced approach is needed. But can you give any examples of this? So where it would be a good idea to burn versus don't burn?
Yeah. So this is actually a good comment. It's a much more nuanced approach. It's a gray area. I can give a very simple example. In Croatia, there is a nature park which is forested, and before it became a nature park, you had small fires happening every 20 years. Maybe a local farmer his prescribed fire would get out of control, or maybe local, people on an excursion, local family would leave the barbecue on. But because it happened every 10 or 20 years, the fires wouldn't be very large, only the underbush would caught fire. And they were easy to manage, they were easy to put out, but still they would manage to burn some fuel which accumulated in the forest floor. And then it became a nature park, and you had fire rangers, and you had people taking care of this area. So over the last 40 years, there were very few fires. And every time we as scientists visit this forest, this mountain, you're just amazed by the staggering amount of bark and cones and branches accumulated on the floor. And we know already the fire is going to happen one way or another sometime in the future. And when it happens, there will be no way of stopping it. And the damage it will cause will be massive. And this is about finding the balance, letting some fires burn for some time to get rid of this fuel. Because if you just say no more burning, you are risking of repeating the scenario from California.
I was going to say, didn't somebody suggest we should be sweeping up the bark and the cones?
That's
tidying up underneath the trees.
they are doing this in some smaller protected areas in the world, but it's not a very effective way of doing things. Yeah.
Must be a good way of employing people.
Yes, yes,
A never-ending job.
yes. Removing leaves from a forest, yeah, never going to go out of business. Yeah.
So David's come in again with, do mountains make a difference? For example, the flow of wind and things like this.
So yeah, if you look at the mountains in Europe, especially in the Mediterranean environment, you will see that most of them are not very vegetated. The higher you go, the thinner the forest cover is. So if you look at the fires in Europe, they don't happen in mountains that often, especially in the Mediterranean. However, slope actually does affect the spread of fire, and fire spreads much quicker on a sloped terrain than it does on the flat terrain. Because if you have a sloped terrain and if the fire is burning here, I don't know if you can see me in the corner, you can even more easily reach the higher parts of the slope. So we do try to prevent fires happening in sloped areas much more quickly, because we do understand that if they're happening on a sloped area, they will spread much quicker. So again, there are pros and cons in terms of mountains. They are less vegetated, so less likely to burn, less likely to have devastating fires. But on the other hand, as soon as you have a sloped terrain, the fire will spread much quicker.
So you'd need to think about building in bigger fire breaks and things like that to try and take that into account.
And also avoid beautiful Aleppo pine trees, which are green and spectacular and very, very popular in Mediterranean Europe. And they are an invasive species, but they're still being planted in some places because they're just green and grow really quickly, and tourists love them.
And oily.
Yes.
A bit like the eucalyptus trees as well.
Yes.
Nice fire starters. But yeah, so and lastly, David's put in a comment about, should you always try to prevent peat from burning?
So I must say I'm not an expert in peat, but I know that the areas, peatlands in the UK have been decreasing. And we use peat in many, many different ways. One of the most simple ones is when you buy
Compost.
potting mix for your house plants. There is peat there. And the only thing I actually know about peat is we should try to keep it as much as we can, because it's a very important carbon sink and is decreasing in the UK. So my initial knee-jerk reaction would be, yes, we always need to prevent peat from burning.
I think part of the problem is as well is that it was always used as a fuel. Yes. So I think once they do start burning, yes, you've got that continual low grade of burning, don't you, that lasts for ages, because it is such a carbon source. Yes, that there's a lot of fuel in there that is a slow burn. So I think it's really difficult to control once it does start burning.
It can be burning under the surface, not just on the surface.
Yes.
So yes, I think probably, if nobody else has got any question, that's probably a really good place for us to finish up on. So yeah, if there's nothing else, just give us a second. But all I'd like to say is thank you very much for a really interesting talk, Maren. And obviously we've created some discussion around it, and I think everybody's going to be going home thinking about the fires and well, as we all try to keep warm over the next few days. And yeah, thank you very much for an interesting talk, and thank you to everybody that's come along. And with that, just to remind people, there won't be a Café Sci in January. It's far too close to when everybody's having a holiday, but we'll be back again in February. Okay, so without further ado, I will say thank you and hope to see you all again sometime soon. Take care.
Thank you very much.